Thanks as always for listening to Fluff and Crunch. In this episode, Chris and I take two famous literary and cinematic, both of them each, properties, and we take the party of characters, the adventurers, if you want to call them that, and we try to figure out how one would make these as characters using a very well-known level-based game and a generic take on skill-based games. Hint, hint, we don't have a lot of luck there. So we are recording. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Jeremy.
All right. We don't need to talk about our gaming because we haven't done any since last time we talked. So we could make up stuff, but we're not all about that. We make up stuff at our tables. We don't make up stuff about the stuff that we make up. So what are we here to talk about today? I'm looking forward to this, and our backgrounds are representative of the two main tent poles of our discussion today. And the topic is...
Oh, how are we going to phrase it? Okay.
Sorry.
You threw in it then. I guess like big media properties that do not translate, or literary properties that do not translate into the role-playing things, despite having role-playing settings supposedly that are either based on them or inherit from them. And yeah, kind of wise thing.
And what we mean, I think what we mean by don't translate is if you actually, and here are our two tent poles, big surprise, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. What we're saying is, if you take, you go to the movies or you read the book, you're like, oh my gosh, I want to play this. Like every GM, every player has had that moment. Oh, I want this thrill at my table. If you want to play either of those as they are presented and actually use the rules of some of the major games that are out there, maybe even either including the games that were directly and shamelessly and back in the 70s in violation of copyright law inspired by Tolkien. Remember the halflings, they used to be called hobbits in the oldest printings. That it's really actually very hard, maybe impossible, especially in some kinds of systems, to do these stories the way they are actually presented on screen or in literature.
Yeah. I mean, this came out of literally after we finished recording our last episode, which depended on the order these come out on, was the one we talked about sort of the certain genres that don't really work very well in a campaign. Yeah. And we just started joking about some of the things that we're now going to talk about. And Jeremy was like, we need to do an episode of that. That's hilarious. We'll probably, my worry was that all of the really funny, good stuff we said on Monday night will have since forgotten.
No way.
But yeah,
we'll come up with new funny stuff.
Yeah, it is worth pointing out what we're really talking about, because like we like talking about system, setting, story. We're not talking about setting here. Okay, there's no reason you can't play in the Star Wars setting or in the Lord of the Rings setting. And there's another one we'll do at the end, probably if we have time. We're talking mostly about story, and particularly the story that you've seen, you've read about, or you've seen in the cinema, and you go, I really want to recreate that story. What we're kind of saying is it's either A, you just can't, or you can't in the systems that you probably would want to. So let's start with Lord of the Rings.
Let's do it.
We had a good laugh about that, because I think we started, the conversation was kind of like along the lines of, wait a minute, what? Like D&D is based on Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. So, my thought was it's so obvious, given when D&D came from, the Hobbit, and then the Lord of the Rings books became very popular in the 70s. The Hobbit cartoon came out and was on television. That whole Tolkien fantasy and many of the knockoffs and otherwise of it became very popular in the 70s and into the 80s. And so it was the literary foundation from which so much of D&D sprung. And, famously maybe not famously, but I know that, like I said, in the earliest versions of D&D, they weren't halflings, they were hobbits. And then Tolkien said, the estate, that you can't do that. And so suddenly they become halflings.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we can see, particularly in the races is the thing, obviously, that stands out. Your classic D&D, your classic fantasy races are humans, and then elves, dwarves, halflings, and the main bad guy is orcs and goblins.
Yes.
Does that sound familiar? Yeah, because yes, because that's what Tolkien wrote
and
about, and
elves
that's what we have.
elves are, elves are they live for a long time. They live in forests. They're pretty, all that stuff. Dwarves are gruff and they live underground and they mine things. And humans are the upstarts. I mean, but that was Tolkien's world.
Yeah.
Where I grabbed onto this or started thinking about this is the idea of the fellowship, and the fellowship in the literal sense is the fellowship being that group. That now let's translate it into game terms. That group of adventurers, and that group of adventurers, in my mind, is made up of 3 mechanically incompatible subgroups. What are those mechanically incompatible? Because again, if we're taking D&D as the way that most people would seek to or have sought to express this, maybe directly, what are those 3 mechanically incompatible subgroups we've got?
So obviously we have the hobbits.
We have the 4 hobbits.
Now you could say we're going to throw the hobbits away. The hobbit, 2 of the hobbits are the main characters.
That's true.
And the other 2 are virtually always, not always, but a good chunk of the time. Let's if we take, both the last 2 books, when the Fellowship splits up, they do it in such a way that those 2 hobbits are intertwined with the other characters, particularly in Return of the King. So the hobbits.
That's a good point, actually. Story-wise, you can't take the hobbits as a single group because they are treated in pairs as to how they fit into the story. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that's true.
And if we look at them on D&D terms, they're sort of, they're NPC. They're like level 0 people with NPC.
Like Merry
classes.
And Pippin are like, who the hell would want to play Merry or Pippin? Like you'd have your obnoxious little brother or that one person in your party who always likes to, like, I'm being funny or I'm being wacky or I'm just playing my character and being a royal pain in the ass throughout.
At least if you get to the end of Return of the King and then like the expansion sort of stuff, at least then Merry and Pippin have got they've got extra size, they have extra strength. They're actually both half decent at fighting, and they basically fight a war in the Shire. So they may be, by the end of that, they have levels in a fighter or something.
It takes a long time.
But it takes a long time. But like Frodo, arguably, the only reason Frodo you could even class as a thief is because he has the ring. He doesn't do any backstabbing. He doesn't do any other thief stuff. He just has stealth. So arguably, most of those guys go through the 3 books with sort of their level 0 characters with NPC classes.
Yeah, and let's just take this. We're going to take Lord of the Rings and the Fellowship. We're going to try to translate it through D&D because that's what it informed. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Bilbo, we can clearly say, you could slap some class levels on Bilbo, but Frodo, I mean, there is no class levels. And
even if we look at a skill-based game like 2D20, what does Frodo have? Okay, he's quite well read. That's it. He's quite well read. Arguably, he doesn't have ranks in stealth. He's a hobbit, and hobbits probably innately have some kind of thing.
But there's nothing about him that's okay.
He's not trained in it. He hasn't learned how to do stealth. Arguably, Merry and Pippin have. It sounds like they've spent they probably have ranks in deception and stealth and maybe sleight of hand. They probably have that kind of stuff. Sam can do gardening and cooking.
Well, and Sam also, much like a cleric, Sam has other character assisting buffs.
Yes.
If this were 2D20, he would have some kind of talents that would, when he does something to assist another character, that character would get bonuses like slap some dirt on it, Mr. Frodo, or something like that, where he emboldens Frodo to continue on.
What you've really got here is that it would work better in 2D20, but they would still be horribly underskilled compared to the other. You can imagine, like, if we use like an archetype system where Sam has like the assistant or the sidekick or the best friend archetype, and he gets all these cool assistant stuff, and the other 2 get some things, and Frodo basically has nothing, but he gets a magic ring. That's it. He has a magic ring, and then everyone treats him like he's special and throws other magic stuff.
You know what? Maybe there's some kind of innate hobbit. Again, it goes back to the innate thing. Maybe there's some kind of innate hobbit quality. You'd call it a racial ability, or whatever they're calling him now. Like on the D&D side, where you'd say, maybe the hobbits are less, are slightly more resistant to the the psychic overtures of the One Ring. You know, the ambitious men are not, and the gold grubbing dwarves and the arrogant snob elves are or does the ring not work on the elves? Whatever. But point is, maybe there, but again, that's something that would be of the hobbits, not of them as a character.
I'm going to do like the halving ability in 5e, where if you roll a 1, you get to re-roll the 1, which basically is showing they're lucky. That's cool.
Yeah.
But they're basically naff. And over the course of 3 very large books, Frodo has character progression. Arguably, he has like no skill progression. He doesn't get better at anything. He gets whinier.
Yes, he does. I used to say, I've said for years, actually, not used to say, I've said this for years, that I wish there was a special, special director's collection of the 3 Lord of the Rings movies in which Frodo, all of his whining is removed. Each movie would be like 87 minutes, something like that. Like 3/4 of all Frodo scenes would be reduced. Anyway, okay, right. So the trouble with the hobbits is that there's virtually nothing about the hobbits that is class worthy or level worthy. Now, what's one of the other subdivisions?
So then we have, I think let's jump to let's go to the far extreme, because then we can come back to this idea we had. So the far extreme obviously is Gandalf. Now you can look at Gandalf as, he's this wise old guy and he does a bit of magic. That's kind of what he's like in The Hobbit. He turns up at the beginning, he sets them all off. He comes back, he does some stuff.
He shows up and he takes these innocents and throws them into danger. That's another way of looking at it.
It's like he's an NPC in that. But in Lord of the Rings, that isn't the case. He doesn't do huge amounts in the Fellowship. Apart from when he goes toe to toe with a Balrog.
Well, yes,
almost wins. And then he comes back and he's like, the perfect example of him, he's leveled up. He comes back, it's like he's stronger, his magic's better, he looks better, he's not sort of bumbling buffoony anymore. He's like, everything's sorted. And he, just kicks ass. I mean, the guy's basically, depending on how we look at it, he's like an angel or this like super powerful wizard. I mean, he's not a wizard in D&D terms, because he spends most of the time walking around with this massive sword and riding a horse. Yeah, he doesn't have any armor.
Yeah, find me a class that can be played like that, especially, in the original game. I mean, in fact, all the way up until you start all this like over the top, like the prestige classes in 3X and beyond. Yeah, I guess you could say, well, yeah, he could multi-class as a magic user, fighter, or something else. Yeah, and then wait until like 18th level in 1st or 2nd edition to be able to do any of that stuff. So I'm going to say that, so we've got the subgroups. I said there were 3, but in my mind, Gandalf is a subgroup of 1.
Yes.
Because Gandalf is this outlier that doesn't fit well anywhere. And you're right, actually. It's so weird, because so often, I remember as a kid thinking Gandalf's a wizard. They called him the Wandering Wizard. Yep. But in D&D terms, he's not. No. He's not slinging spells. He's not making magic items by burning up experience. What an odd archetype that doesn't fit the things that flow from it. It's like the professional athlete whose kid becomes like a chess master. Like, where did that come from outside of maybe competitiveness?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, he's not as bad. We'll get to Jedi and Star Wars, but he's kind of like that. He can do everything. The difference is that he doesn't do it all the time. You kind of get the feeling he could do stuff, but for most of that first film, he kind of just does a bit of sword fighting, and he shows that he is clever and he can do magic when he needs to, but he doesn't really. It's not until he fights Saruman and throws around some actual magic.
It's fascinating, actually. It's a really good point, because what he really does is he provides narrative motivation, and he provides information. So as a plot device, he's the foot that kicks their ass over the cliff, or says, "Come a little closer. Hey kid, try this. Don't be a square." He goes ahead and entices them to go off on this thing, and then he provides information to the characters. But he doesn't Didn't do any wizardy kinds of things.
It's his wizarding is weird because it's like, oh, he fights Saruman, so then he needs some magic, but then he's going to fight some orcs and a troll, and he just like hits him with a sword.
Yeah.
And then he goes to fight a Balrog, and it's like he's probably using some magic there, but but he's still fighting with.
I think it's the robe and the pointy hat. I think that was
like
the disguise that fooled people into thinking, oh, he's a wizard, and then the use of the term the wandering wizard.
So I mean, if you were going to look at that, you got something like Radagast is straight up much more of a wizard, although
good point.
A druid, because you don't see him do any of the crazy fighting stuff. He talks to animals, and that's that. And then Saruman, again, you don't see Saruman fighting. Saruman has a big staff, and he does magic, and he leads an army. That's so. But yeah, Gandalf's like, I mean, who let Gandalf be part of that D&D party? So yeah, I want to be a really good fighter. Oh, I want really high levels in like authority, and everyone knows me. I want to be able to do kick-ass magic occasionally.
A 12-year-old kid.
Yeah,
that's what it was. So we've got the hobbits. And the question is, what if you were going to go D&D? Like, what classes would they even be? They're really like NPC classes, is what it seems like. Then you've got Gandalf. I have no idea. What odd mishmash of classes would you use? What about the other subgrouping, which actually is a group?
So the other group then does at least feel like a D&D party, except for there's one issue I have with them. Yeah. So we have Aragorn, and we have Gimli and Legolas and Boromir until he kicks it. But we have a group of 4 people there.
Mm-hmm. Hey, that sounds like an adventuring party.
Sounds like an adventure party. They're all very well skilled.
Or an adventuring party sounds like them, is more like it.
And they're all skilled. They're all well trained. They all have their key different weapons. Mostly they fight with slightly different weapons. Some of them have magic like things. They have different backgrounds. Yeah. Sounds cool. The one issue I had is actually, if you try to match them to classes, this is how I would actually go. Because everyone goes, oh, Aragorn, he's definitely a ranger.
Well, he's called a ranger, isn't he?
He's called a ranger, but in D&D terms, he doesn't cast spells.
Nope.
And he's not one of those old school rangers or Pathfinder rangers where he has an animal companion.
So wait a minute. So you're saying he could be he could be a first edition ranger, but with not a particularly high wisdom, so that he couldn't cast the spells.
Yeah, so I think really, I might say, well, he's a fighter, because that's what he does. He fights.
Yeah,
he might have a high charisma, but he basically is a fighter, because we see him do lots of fighting. He knows some stuff. Maybe he has skill. Maybe he has proficiencies in like Arcana or nature and stuff. But he's basically a fighter. He's not really a ranger. He's not doing a lot of rangery stuff. Gimli obviously is a fighter. Totally. And then we go to Legolas, and all we can say is, oh, he's a fighter again.
Well, no, he doesn't do any magic.
No.
So he's not an elf, when elf was a class in the earliest time of first edition. He doesn't fit that. Yeah, he is a fighter, albeit one whose focus is on ranged attacks.
Yeah. But even when he uses hand-to-hand attacks, he has... I mean, I feel like Legolas is just a person who had really high stats. He just rolled well. Actually, Aragorn did as well. And you go to Boromir, and people like to go, Boromir is a barbarian, because in the old Ralph Bakshi cartoon, that's what he looked like.
Right. He's got the fuzzy loincloth and all that.
And he kind of rages a lot. But then if you go off the films or off the books, he's just another fighter.
Yeah. Well, and also barbarian does not make sense given his lineage.
No, not at all.
Given his own personal background, barbarian makes no sense whatsoever. So yeah, the Bakshi cartoon, no, doesn't work.
So then I go that right. So we have
4 fighters.
We have 4 fighters. We have 4 level 0 NPC class losers. We have 4 fighters, and then, I mean, realistically, I feel like Gandalf's, and this is what came to. Gandalf's the DM. Gandalf's like literally, he's dungeon master. He turns up, he tells you some stuff you need to do. He then pisses off. He then comes back and spouts some more useless stuff.
So what you're saying is that Gandalf is the DM's desire to be involved in the story more than it's just the DM.
Yeah. He's just like, when they need to be pointed in the right direction, or things aren't quite working out, or they've gone off on a tangent. It's like taking the 2 towers, the 3 people, instead of concentrating on fighting the people, they've decided to go off and chase after 2 hobbits. They're not going and solving the war in Rohan or going up against Salmon. They decided the most important thing is going after those 2 NPCs that went, Merry and Pippin, and that's what they're going to do. And then he goes, oh, for God's sake. So the DM goes, oh, Gandalf turns up, and now he's white and says, oh, no, there's something a brewing in Rohan. We need to go and solve that one. And they go, oh, okay. So, yeah.
Gandalf's something else, too. If the DM is running Gandalf as a personal GM PC, that explains away the fact that it doesn't fit any class, because it's just the DM's narrative avatar.
Yeah.
And the DM reserves the right to break any rules he darn well wants to. So he just puts together this oddball character. Now, what about for the other 4, for the 4 fighters, with some variety between them? What levels are we talking about here? Because I think this is important.
I mean, I guess it doesn't hugely matter. I mean, you're not high. You're in the sort of, between 5 and 10, that sweet spot where you've gained a couple of interesting abilities.
The playable range.
Nothing started getting silly yet or complicated. I mean, arguably Gimli doesn't have some of the really cool stuff, but you could explain that away. But I mean, this is why a skill-based thing starts looking better, but then you start going, well, wait a minute. Aragorn and Legolas are both good with sword, bow, athletics, nature, perception, all these other things. And Gimli, he's good with his axe, and he's a dwarf, so he probably has cool dwarf stuff. And then so it falls apart. Then again, essentially what we're saying is these guys don't any kind of idea of balance,
right?
Which virtually every role-playing game that we can think of, we've done a whole episode on balance before, and we've said it doesn't really matter. But this is a perfect example. If you try to do through any system, because even if you say, right, we've kind of said, look, it doesn't really work in D&D, despite D&D being based on it. If you try to do the fellowship in a skill-based system, it still wouldn't work, because the person trying to do Aragorn and Legolas would run out of points, and the person trying to do Gimli would have spare points, because they'd have to start. Oh, did you know that Gimli is actually an expert cook as well? Oh, and he can sail.
Oh, wow. Yeah, who knows? All these here.
I have points left.
Beef up a bunch of stuff that isn't going to be used at all.
Yeah.
Or you have the question of what kind of group of players is going to be hip to the idea of, okay, listen, hey, like for example, Octone Cthulhu, you start out with 51 points, 51 points between your attributes for a new player character. Okay, so listen, you're going to be at 51 points. You're going to be the private or the corporal or the buck sergeant. Okay, you're going to start off with 75 points because you're the seasoned operative. You're going to work together. Now that can work in stories, but you're right. I think this unconscious, unexamined adherence to the idea of balance, and also just the sense of, I think generally most people want to approach the game from a sense of parity with other players. That creates a problem. Looking at a level-based system, what are you going to have? Let's be kind, and let's give the hobbits levels. Let's make them like first or second level something or another's. What?
They're all ones.
They're all level ones. And so if we have 4 level 1 characters, and then we take the fighters and let's put them all, let's say like 7, like
7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, right in there. You have 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you've got this like weird, your 13-year-old GM made up Gandalf. I don't know what that is. Given especially the last 20 some years with D&D and challenge ratings, forget about balance between characters. How about the dependence on balance between characters to balance encounters? How do you build encounters?
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't. Almost anything that is a remote challenge for the 4 fighters one shots the 4 halflings,
right?
Which never happened.
Yeah. Which narrative? Wait, what do you mean never happened in the stories, or what?
At no point did any of them take one hit. And, I mean, just they didn't die. They made it through all of those encounters, and they got all the way to the end, and they survived. Boromir got into a fight with a bunch of orcs, or Uruk-hai, which they're higher level orcs.
Sure.
And he did actually die. And Gandalf died, but Gandalf died fighting the Balrog. So
yeah, okay. So this is a good point. You could say, well, the Uruk-hai, they never hit the hobbits, so they couldn't do all that damage that they did to poor Sean Bean's character. But wait, How in the heck, if the Uruk-hai were badass enough to take down Boromir, maybe you could say, well, they're not that bad, but there are several of them, so they get some kind of a group attack bonus. They're gonna, even though he's, let's say, make him an 8th level fighter, if they're, you have 4 or 5 of them that are lower challenge rating, they're going to eventually catch up with him. How did they then not ever catch up with the hobbits? What did the hobbits have to be able to bring to bear mechanically to continuously avoid them? Unless you just keep lumping more like racial abilities on the hobbits, that like they can just slip out of any problem whatsoever.
I think you actually go through the sensible DMing thing where you just go, they are so not a threat, but you just don't attack them. You just don't bother wasting attack. They just didn't attack them. They attacked.
But the Uruk-hai were after them because they had the ring.
Yeah, but they capture them, so that they literally just true. They just grab them. They grab them and run. They don't bother fighting them. So actually, the hobbits don't do much fighting. That's kind of the same all the way. The only time you see the hobbits doing much fighting is by the time you get to the 3rd book, or arguably when they're in the mines in the first one.
And this, by the way, remember, listeners, we are. I mean, I think we're not being explicit in our separation here, but there's the wire fu Fast and Furious level action of the movies.
Yeah.
And then there's what's in the books. So you could consider either. You could take either route and say, how am I supposed to express this with levels or skills?
So clearly there's a problem, but I think you, even if you say we're not going to use it, the level-based system clearly has massive issues. Even if you just take the four fighters, I think you still got issues. But I think if you go down a skill-based thing, I think you've got issues again. Now, one of the reasons I think you avoid this is that, like we said, we're kind of applying this to a campaign thing. As a campaign, this doesn't work very well. As a one-shot, it could work. You give each of the 4 players, you give them one of the 4 fighters. They also get one of the hobbits to play in scenes where the fighters aren't there, or to look after, so they're always having to defend that one. And like we said, Gandalf is the GM. And then that worked, but it would have to be on a short thing. Like the thing you said about some characters are way more powerful than others. In a one shot, I think that matters way less, because in a one shot, and we talked about this last episode, in a one shot it's mostly about telling the story. Whereas in a campaign, it isn't just the story. The story evolves over time. The story might end up being something very different, but also you kind of got, it is about improving your characters and the character development, but also character development in terms of personality, but also skills and more armor and all this other cool stuff. That doesn't, Lord of the Rings isn't trying to do that. It's a big, long, epic story, but it's not a campaign, arguably, even though it's long. It wouldn't work because someone's got to play, Gimli, and Gimli's a bit naff, really.
I think you just hit on something though. And this will be a shameless plug for 2D20. You could have the core party as the fighters. You could build tough fighters using a generally nondescript fantasy system that maybe someone's working on. Anyway, you could do that. And then what you do is you use the supporting characters mechanic.
Yeah.
To flesh out the hobbits when they are used separately from the 4 core characters. And then you use the player controlled NPC mechanic and protect them. But then that becomes part of that becomes a mechanical expression of a story element. And then Gandalf is just flat out reserved as the GM showing up as dungeon master, Gandalf master, and doing that, and then you just don't have to worry about it. I think that could work. You can't do it. Maybe I don't know. Maybe you could try that same thing with D&D, with a level-based system.
I think
the mechanics are already built in to use those 4 hobbits in a more sensical way in 2D20.
I think you can do it in D&D or level-based thing. I think you've got to accept that the 4 hobbits are not PCs.
Yeah.
And just at all. Or if they are going to be PCs, it's easier to have, they're like your backup characters and you only use them when they go off and do their own thing. And the rest of the time, they're NPCs and you're guarding them. That would be so much easier.
Yeah, there can't be parity between them and the others.
Let's move on to our second property. Mine is above me, but it could be to the left or right of me, which is Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've got a similar thing here if we're talking about leveling, but there's a very different story here, because the thing we have here is we've said in Lord of the Rings that none of the characters massively develop. Okay, they have stories, and Aragorn goes from like, ranger to reluctant king to king.
Yeah.
But does he get much better at anything? We don't know. Now, if we look at Star Wars, of course, we have the classic that when we say Star Wars, of course, we're talking about the original trilogy. We're not talking about the prequels, because that would be easier.
And we're not going to mention the other ones.
Well, yeah, that would have similar problems.
Good point.
Just you can repeat the exact same problems. The prequels would be very different. Everyone's a Jedi. Oh, that sounds fun. Yeah, very easy. Except for the Padme player. So if we go with the original trilogy, like we jokingly said this the other, we kind of said, right, to start off with in D&D terms, at the start of New Hope, episode 4, what you want to call it, or just Star Wars, Luke is like, he's maybe he's level 2 or 3, maybe if you're being generous. If we're looking, we're not going to do D&D levels. We're going to do, there was a Star Wars saga thing. He's maybe got a level in pilot or something, because we had different classes in that. Han might genuinely be level 7, 8, 9, 10. He's very good at fighting. He's very good at flying a ship. He's also, he has proficiencies in sort of like charm and ship maintenance and piloting, a whole bunch of stuff. Chewbacca arguably is even higher level because of his age. He's probably got a massive stack of hit points and, huge strength stats. And he can use a gun, and he can fix the ship. Oh, and he can fly the ship, as it turns out. And then you disagreed with Leia, but I think Leia is somewhere between Luke and Han.
I think you're right. More I thought about it, I think you're right.
She's a diplomat. She doesn't have anything, but she has a very, she's probably a very high charisma, but she'll have massively high skill ratings in, anything to do with diplomacy and persuasion, and potentially also deception and insight, all kinds of things like that. You'd need a whole class where what she gets is loads of cool abilities about doing diplomacy things and leading people. Something else too, Leia.
And I think this is most pronounced with Han and Leia. Both of them have, through knowledge and connections and potential leverage through their connections and their position and their experiences, that to me implies, if you were using a system that had some kind of
like storyteller.
Built into, exactly. Upon creation with backgrounds, but also systems that, as you finish adventures, you establish new traits or, status. You pin more things to the character that say, I was here, I now have access to these people or these resources. That right there implies some period of growth having already taken place, and that's clearly not the word I'm looking for. Situation with Luke.
No, because the others, if we go across Chewbacca probably doesn't develop at all across 3 films. He was already very high level. He stays high level. Han, again, I wouldn't say maybe he learns to be a bit more tolerant, but he gets ranks. He gets kind of in game. Right, or story kind of benefits. He gets a rank. He pays off Jabba, all that. He gets that. Leia arguably does level up. We see Leia actually doing some combat throughout the sort of the later ones. She does more than just being a pretty face, although she does.
There's a lot to, and if you were to draw out the many books that came out before the prequels, that now don't exist outside of canon. Leia develops like her Jedi powers and things. There are mechanically definable things that she picks up over time.
But then Luke breaks any kind of, whether it's level based or just skill based, he just breaks any kind of system, because he goes from in the first film, he's very, very low. Okay, he's quite good at piloting. We're told that repeatedly, quite good at piloting. He gets how to use a lightsaber. He can't use it. He's not Rey in Force Awakens, who the first time she used a lightsaber,
it's Mary Sue.
Someone, and I just ignored that because I was like,
Rey's middle name's Mary Sue.
Again, that never bothered me when I watched it, because I was with Dad and we were like, oh, this is awesome. But you can go back and you can get annoyed by that, or you can not be annoyed. It doesn't matter. But Luke doesn't do that, and then at the end he gets he's flown a ship. Okay, we do that, and he gets a lucky shot because Obi-Wan lets him use Force, which is like him developing his Force. Now in the second one, he's probably already on par with Han. So he's gone from level 1 to 8.
Well, and if you were using a level-based system, Luke's got to pick up a level or 2 during A New Hope.
Yes,
I think, and Han does not. No, nobody else does.
No.
But you're right. I think by the time Empire comes around, he's picked up obviously even more, which makes sense because time has passed.
Yeah,
but
it's like 2 years.
You could make sense of that on a character sheet by saying, well, I added these levels, and like in 5e and 3x land, hey, this level brought me this new class ability and this stat boost and but what's the implication as Luke rockets forward up the scale of levels?
Well, I don't know. We're going to say balance again.
Well, yeah, the lack of balance. Like, what is if Luke's like, what are the experience? And remember, back in first edition, the experience bands for levels were different. They weren't all the same. Is Luke's class Junior Jedi, he needs 10 experience points to make his next, and then like 20 and 40. Everyone else is like, no, Han, you need 40,000 experience to make your next. So yeah, we're all chugging along and collecting experience points. And Luke's character's like, yeah, I chose the right class. His players,
that would actually work in one of those systems where the XP is different in each class. It would actually work.
Sure.
Fun. Like
Chewbacca piss off the other people at the table.
Well, but it's the same if you did it on a skill-based thing. You're basically going, right, Han, you start with 100 skill points, and Chewbacca, you start with 110. Leia, you get 60. Right, and then you run this 3-session like Star Wars thing, and the rest. Right, guys, between session 1 and 2, Han, you can have four points. Chewie, you don't get any. Leia, you can have 20 points. Luke, you get 100.
Yeah.
Sorry, what? Yeah, you get 100. Oh, and here's a bunch of abilities you couldn't do before you get that. Then you go to Jedi, and you're like, yeah, Luke, you get another 100. You can add all this other stuff.
This is like if the Luke's player is the GM's best friend.
Or
everyone else at the table is like, this is crap.
Even better, it's the girlfriend that had never played role-playing before. I was going to say, she started off with a really simple character that was easy to do, and you're just showing her, hey, this is how you use a lightsaber. You roll this, you add that skill. This is how you do piloting. You've got a no, it's all right.
You destroyed the Death Star.
Yeah,
Woo,
well done. Right, next time she's played a bit more. All right, guys, second story now. Okay, I've leveled up my girlfriend's character. She now has the Force, and she has her own lightsaber. She's also got a rank.
But that just means that it's going to be more balanced between everyone, and everyone else is just sitting there. Yeah,
this actually makes real sense as well, because then they stay together for Jedi, and he makes them even more powerful. But then, maybe they got married for Jedi, but then in between that and Last Jedi, they got divorced, and then he hated Luke. Sorry for swearing. And then that's why Luke's such a shit character in Last Jedi, because he's like, I never liked him. I never liked Luke. This is what Luke's going to be, like grumpy like old
bitter guy on an island drinking like mutant yak milk.
That was like
I
Luke
mentioned the movie. Ugh. What'd you do to me?
Luke was an NPC in Last Jedi,
and
he ruined the character to get his payback, even though they'd been divorced for 20 years. It didn't matter. I'm ruining this character. She loved this character. I'm going to ruin him. I don't like Luke anyway. Luke was always annoying. It was always
so back to so it doesn't work with levels. Star Wars absolutely does not work with levels unless you're willing to have some people just sit there and not gain levels while someone else like rockets up the scale and picks up wazoo powers. And then again, it brings up this problem of encounter balance.
Yeah, be all over the shop.
It'd be all over the map. What are you going to do? Like, let's just have. Then the moment you introduce Darth Vader to the scene, think about this. In a typical Darth Vader, if Darth Vader did not exist in the popular consciousness, okay, if you remember the scene in Empire where they show up in Cloud City and he's like, "Come join me for dinner," and he like steals, that kind of thing. Whatever.
Just blocks lasers with his
blocks a blaster. He's that cool. What if you dropped that character? What would the party do? What would 9 out of 10, 99 out of 10?
They were just attacking. They would just keep attacking him.
They would They would attack, and then Darth Vader would do what?
Well, Darth Vader does what he does. Straight away, he blocks his attack and then steals his weapons off him. But then at that point, they stop attacking. They realize. No,
I'm saying what would your typical stable of players do?
They just carry on attacking,
and they would TPK.
Yeah,
Darth Vader
would just they wouldn't accept it. They would be going and hitting him with their fists, and he's like, okay, boom.
Yeah, he would dead. TPK them, or he would knock them out. He would win. Period.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a. And then skill based, I mean, you would, again, like you said, you'd have, you know, Han Solo, Chewbacca, you start with 150 points. Oh, and by the way, the maximum skill in piloting is X. Yours is X plus 3 because you're Chewbacca.
It just, it wouldn't work, because the jump in what you have to give to Luke, you're basically telling you, sorry guys, you're not gaining any of the skills because you're already skilled. But this other guy is going to gain all the skills and all these cool abilities you don't have access to. I mean, actually, if you use the most recent Star Wars game, I mean, none of the, we've talked about this already. We like the Star Wars role playing. Well, I mean, not the one in the middle, but we like the original D6 version, and I like the new one that, you know, with the narrative dice thing. But actually, if you try and do the stories in it, you can't. I'm not even sure you can make Luke very easily at all. You can make Farm Boy Luke easily. The minute you start trying to add on all the Jedi stuff on top of all his piloting stuff, it would need so much XP to do it.
Again, what you said at the beginning, though, still holds true. Lord of the Rings as a setting, and the types of stories that took place in it, or take place in it, however you want to look at it. Same thing for Star Wars. You could make characters. I mean, and you know, we can debate the value and appropriateness or whatever of level-based versus skill-based versus whatever types of systems. Forget about that. You can make characters and play in the Star Wars universe. You make players and, you know, play in the Lord of the Rings. You can go run around the Shire, Mirkwood, or whatever like that. So it's not the setting that does the damage. It's the stories that those original authors put in those settings. And they're great stories, but they actually just don't translate mechanically to a tabletop role-playing game as they are, because of how we've built expectations for characters and encounters and things like that and experience. This doesn't make sense.
I do have a solution for both of these. And to use that, I'm going to talk about another example of something that at first glance, it is impossible to play this party. And that is, if we go to comics and we look at the Avengers. Yeah. Now, realistically, the Avengers it's Gandalf, Lord of the Rings stupid level. In the classic, if we go the classic, it's like 10 years old. We go to the Avengers lineup in the first Avengers film. We go from, you know, we have Captain America. Okay, he's like superhuman. Well, barely superhuman. Top level human. He has a cool shield that does cool stuff. He's like got all of the charisma in the world and, like, you know, off the charts speech making skill. Because I'm going to do skill based for this. It doesn't work in levels because no one's really made a level based superhero thing. Because even when they did it in Mutant to Mastermind, you start at level 10. Yeah. And you go up and down in points. They didn't have you advance, so everyone starts this level.
And also, it didn't really have classes. Like what the heck is what class is a Captain America? So let's stick with skills.
So we got Iron Man. He's like super intelligent. He can build whatever he wants, and he happens to always walk around in a variation of different sets of super cool power armor that give him like any ability he wants. And then, you know, we have the Hulk, the strongest alive, and he just gets stronger. You know, if you went D&D, actually, Hulk's a barbarian, so it would work. So, you know, we have the Hulk. He's the strongest thing alive. He gets hit, he just gets stronger. He's virtually indestructible. And we can keep going down that way. We have Thor, God, the god Thor. You know, the Norse god from myth, that one, Thor. That one. And then in the same party is a quite fit lass that is good with her things and really good stealthy stuff. And she probably, you know, she's very well trained and maybe has some borderline pushing her into like high level stuff. I would put her crazy stuff they've done to her.
I take Captain America, and he is like physically and charisma wise, he's like absolute like pinnacle of humanity. Yeah. But the thing that pushes him over the edge to like superhuman is the fact that he's got all of these different things, and he's got his shield and crap like that. Black Widow doesn't have all that synergy, but she's still top level in some ways, top level human. And the last one is
Guy with bow.
Great shot.
I mean, he's a very good shot.
Yeah.
And occasionally they let him be a pilot as well.
Right.
But he's a really good shot. Now, again, if you try and do that in properly in most superhero systems, it wouldn't make any sense. If we go back to like classic, the one we talk about the most, the classic phase rip Marvel superheroes, in the same party, that just makes no sense. And it's come with that thing you said, balance. How can you balance an encounter where you have to have something that is a challenge, anything that's a challenge for Thor and the Hulk, one shots Hawkeye.
Yep.
He just goes and he's dead, just dead. Like, it's like Boy's Dead, where he's been pulped into the ground and bloods and bits have gone flying everywhere. That's what would happen. He's a good shot. Now, you can be a nice GM and only have the guy that's kind of like Hawkeye to fight Hawkeye.
Right. You could have the big bad have some footmen that's who Hawkeye deals with. Or maybe Hawkeye is off on the other side of the encounter trying to save the innocents who are trapped in a bus or something like that, the big bad guy has kicked to like the edge of a cliff or something. You're right. You could find some ways. And I'd argue that's how you make an encounter interesting, is you put different challenges within it.
But that's a massive disparity in a thing. But I have seen a system where they were all completely playable, which was not the most recent, because it ain't going to work, because they actually have different levels. Although I've lost count now of what they're doing with their levels and stuff. I get thrown out of the window. So I've kind of given up and I'll just wait till the book comes out. But the most recent that's actually released, the Marvel Heroic system, which uses Cortex, actually worked fine because it's a narrative system.
Yes.
And narratively, it works in that because Thor gets like a D12 in super strength and a D12 in lightning powers and a D12 hammer. So he gets to roll really high dice, and Thor's thing comes in. He can do loads of different stuff. And narratively, he's super strong and super tough, and he can fly and he can do all this cool stuff. But Hawkeye still gets like a D10 in agility and can do lots of cool things with his boat. Now, if you have Hawkeye fight Thor, then it's closer than it should be. But the point is, well, they're not meant to be fighting each other. So that's not really an issue. And it worked. You didn't have to worry about, oh no, this thing can one shot Hawkeye, because kind of if something did hit Hawkeye, well, he's not dead. He hasn't got hit points. He would go down. He'd be knocked out for that scene. He'd get back up in the next scene. And you'd use the narration. You deal with everything narratively.
I think
it worked, and it worked really, really well for that. So you could have this completely mixed party of the Avengers, and Hulk and Thor were a bit better than the others, but the others still had a lot to do. And actually, that's why in the character creation rules for that game, which everyone moaned about, it literally just said, well, you put the dice stats where you feel is appropriate for the character you're trying to make. It didn't say do it balanced. It didn't give you so many points. It just said
figure it out the way you want. Well, in narrative systems, in my experience, highly narrative games work best when the players and the GM are really on the same page, because they need to be on the same page in terms of the vibe and what's permissible and what's acceptable and what's possible. They need to be more on the same page than in a more mechanically dense system, because the mechanically dense system acts as that translation system between people. But a more narrative system that requires people to actually, and I don't say this as a good thing or a bad thing, but they've just got to figure it out. Like for our group, what does that mean? And so those things mean less. I think that's a really good point.
And I think actually, if you go back to the Lord of the Rings now, go, right, let's do Lord of the Rings again with a very narrative system. Actually, now suddenly it works, because Merry and Pippin's just blind luck and bit cheekiness suddenly become useful abilities. That gives them dice to roll. That gives them stuff they can do. Sam's just never give up, never die attitude gives him tons of dice that he gets to roll in certain situations. Frodo's still a 9, but he has a magic ring and plot armor. And then Gandalf just has a bunch of cool stuff that he can do, but maybe it needs tons of sort of meta currency, which is why he doesn't get to sling spells around all the time. He has to build it up to then like slam down a whole bunch of crazy stuff, and then he has to build it up again. So actually then in a narrative system, suddenly it worked. Star Wars still doesn't fully work because Luke still goes from this to this.
Yeah.
So it's still,
well, I
Luke
think
still
also
breaks the system.
If, a narrative system, if everyone around the table is committed to a certain kind of story, the place of the individual character changes than in a game, a more traditional RPG, where we're all working on this together. And the implication is from a relatively equal starting point or equal standing. and we're all contributing to build the story. Whereas in a more narrative type of arrangement, you might have everyone saying, this is the story we'd like to tell. Like, this is the type of endpoint we want to reach. And so we're going to use our characters in subordination to, in support of that, rather than let's work together to figure it out as we go. Characters are different animals in that. Like, you might look at your character as a plot device within the story you're working to tell, not your character as your avatar. It's a little different.
That's why suddenly you can have now the stats where you have the things like values, which, if you've listened to this podcast for ages, you'll know I'm not a big fan of. But then suddenly your values matter more. And so then characters that aren't as strong or as powerful, like from sheer power levels, doesn't matter, because it's on what they can deal with narratively. And likewise, you can have how you do something, not how good you are at doing it. So then you can have, and you work on that, and suddenly it doesn't matter so much.
Or something like Small World. Is that what it's called? Smallville. Small World's a board game.
Exactly.
Smallville, where everything is about relationships and the importance of like your connection to these, your commitment. Maybe I've never played the game, but I've heard about it. Like maybe something like Fellowship, because of this commitment to one another in the Fellowship. Maybe you do it. That could work. But I think you're right that the big problem comes when there are huge, clear disparities, great disparities between the most potent, powerful characters and the least. And if you try to no matter what, but then when you try to marry that with what is the more typical, mechanically robust, and under the you open up the hood and you're like, oh, this is trying to be balanced. It's trying to be balanced in characters, and it's trying to be balanced, whatever that's supposed to mean, in encounters. And you just run face first into this wall that, even though you've been inspired to play these things, and these things have informed, again, D&D, they actually don't work. Not like that.
What would be clever is if there was a system where it has really good mechanics and all the crunch mechanics, if you want that, but it only needs a tiny bit of tweaking, and it can also run narratively. So expect me to do a narrative supers game for 2D20.
Do it.
A, it's much easier to write, and B, based on what we said last episode and what we've said this episode, I'm kind of starting to think that that's the only real way to run supers.
I think you're right.
And maybe it's why everyone says Masks is so good, because that's how Masks does it.
That's its thing. But I think 2D20 offers so many options to push it. We've seen this, Infinity and Conan, and then the other end of the spectrum, and then things in between. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Because I don't think
I have now. I haven't exactly been memorizing all of the posts in the World Builders channel on the official Discord or elsewhere. I don't know if I've heard anyone talking about a supers. I'm really not a narrative one. You should do that. Absolutely do that. All right.
There we go. So So again, we're not saying don't play in the settings. No. We're just saying consider your story when you're picking your system.
And the next time you go see a movie and you're so jazzed walking, like before the credits are even rolling, oh my gosh, this is GMs, especially this happens to us. Oh, I want to run it like this. Think about if you were considering actually just porting the whole thing into a system, especially a level-based system. Put some thought into it before you just try to squeeze it through the mechanics that are sitting there in front of you.
Yeah, that's what I think I might do before I get onto soup is a thing before that. So like a narrative 2D20 cinematic thing. You've just seen this in the cinema and you want to know how to play it really quickly and easily. Try this.
Yeah.
But I'd have to use values. I don't have to. I can use.
You don't have to. You could use approaches or something like that.
I can use
styles
approaches
or whatever.
Yes. I feel like you need two.
All right. Well, we'll beat on that. We'll beat on that later because I think that idea has legs.
Yeah.
All right. Good. Good talking to you as always.
Bye for now.
Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.